Honor. What is it? And what exactly did it mean for the men of the Wild West, the pioneers of the great American frontier? Well, for a cowboy, it could mean protecting the weak or defending yourself against the strong. In the case of Henry McCarty, it meant vengeance, to seek retribution against those who killed a man to whom he owed much. But at what cost does the preservation of honor come? And who pays the price? Join us as we explore what some may deem the tragedy of Billy the Kid. Hi, I'm Ashton Myers, and joining me today is my co-host Riley Osborne. This is Human Histories. Riley's going to talk to you guys about our socials and how you can support the podcast, and then we'll get right into who Billy the Kid was.
Yep, so real quick, just a couple quick ways to support the podcast. Follow us on all our social medias at Human Histories Podcast. That's Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. But more importantly, shoot us an email at humanhistoriespodcast@gmail.com and just give us information that we might have missed in the podcast, and then ask us any questions, and then we can go over them in a later episode and correct ourselves, and also just answer your questions and really be able to interact with you guys. So I'm ready to hop into it, set the stage. Let's talk about Billy the Kid.
All right, so the world that Billy the Kid was born into was a harsh, rugged world. It was also promising, though. It was full of hope and a bright future, but to get to that future, you had to go through a whole lot of adversity. Let's just put it like that, in many different forms. He was born in New York, 1859, to two Irish immigrant parents. And the reason I put emphasis on immigrant is because at this time, there was a lot of them coming to America, 12 million to be exact, by the middle of the 18th century. The reason they came to America is Europe was getting crowded, right? Europe, we know, has been developing for a very long time, and now America was the promised land. And I know you might be thinking, well, why is this relevant? Why are we talking about Europe? This is Billy the Kid. Well, who do you think populated what became the Wild West? Who do you think populated the places where Billy the Kid roamed and the people he dealt with? Well, they were people who came over here for promise. And, what they encountered was, I guess, ranching. They encountered ranching. They encountered the Civil War. They encountered a whole lot of different things in the American frontier. And it wasn't all bad, but it certainly wasn't all good. What motivated the Americans to go west was this idea of manifest destiny. And what this meant basically was the Americans were viewed as this agrarian, which was a rural farming people. Like farming is more noble than being a city slicker, getting paid. You're making your own living, salt of the earth. This was kind of the ethos or the mantra of a lot of Americans, or this was reported to be the ethos. And you could see how this could be attractive or alluring to the people of Europe who, they've lived that lifestyle themselves. Maybe they're a poor peasant farmer, and now they think, hey, you know what, I can go be a rich peasant farmer in America and not be under the tyranny of the crown, right? So, of course, they move over. And what eventually they transformed into were cowboys, right? Because the farming in the West, in the area that Billy the Kid was, there was certainly a lot of farming, but it wasn't like corn and wheat. That was more north. This was ranching, right? This was cattle. This was cowboys, right? The life of a cowboy wasn't an easy one. It wasn't as glamorous as we've been led to believe by all the John Wayne movies. It wasn't rolling into town, sundown, slinging out your gun, and taking out the guy who took your lady. No, it was 18-hour days. It was out on the range, sleeping beside a campfire, waking up to a breakfast of beans, coffee, and bacon. Not knowing when you're getting paid, and what you're getting paid is probably not worth the amount of time you're putting in. But it was a lifestyle that it attracted a lot of young men. Certainly there was the desperado element, the bad boy, the mysterious guy riding off into the sunset. But we can't say that that's exactly what attracted Billy the Kid to this lifestyle as much as it was just poor circumstance, unfortunate circumstance, one that may not have been within his control. And who knows, Billy the Kid may not have ended up the way he did had he not been put in this situation. Or, maybe these events were destined to unfold regardless of Billy the Kid because the nature of the Wild West at this time, which we'll get into. But before that, Riley is going to talk to you guys about who Billy the Kid was, and where he came from, why he became the myth, the legend that he is today.
Yeah, so I'm just going to dive into the early life of Billy the Kid. And you touched on it pretty quickly there about Irish immigrants. And Billy is born to an Irish immigrant family in the New York slums. Now, when the Irish first came over, they were actually only allowed to rent in a certain area of New York. And there was these 12 by 12 rooms where like 20 people would be living in them. And that's what he's born into. And as you can imagine, situations like that where people are living in such close quarters and they're horrible living conditions, his dad, it's assumed, gets sick and dies really early in his life. In fact, we barely know if his dad was even ever around. And it's mostly assumed that Billy never really would have met his dad to the point where he remembered him. So after the passing of his father, his mom sort of moves around a bit, and she goes to a couple different cities and ends up in Silver City. And this is where she becomes a pretty respected woman, actually. And she has a laundry business. She meets a new husband, and she establishes herself pretty well. And she's really respected. Apparently, she always sent Billy and his brother to school. She was keeping it together really well. And then she gets tuberculosis, which in the 1800s, there's no cure for tuberculosis, not even close. But the doctors have this idea that if you move to the West, and the air is dry, it's going to cure your TB. So that's what they do. They head out and they move west and they go to New Mexico. And at this time, now he's becoming a young man. He's probably 10 or 11 years old. So he just really embeds himself in the Hispanic culture that's in New Mexico, because New Mexico is not like part of America right now. New Mexico is barely developed at all. And it's mostly Hispanics and Navajo out in the wild, and Billy just dives right into this culture. And apparently him and his mom used to go, and they'd go to these big festivals. Well, not big, but they'd go to these little festivals, and they were really just part of the Hispanic community. And Billy speaks fluent Spanish. I was reading about one historian who says he could pass as Spanish, which is a bunch of BS in my opinion, because he's about as white as anyone can be. That's like me, someone is saying that I could pass as Spanish because if I could speak Spanish.
I thought you were
yeah,
Filipino.
Dude, I know, right? It was just like a stupid comment I saw. It was one of these documentaries. But they go out there, and then eventually, inevitably, his mother dies of tuberculosis. And this is where it all begins, is when Billy's on his own. He's 15, and his stepdad, who's been with them for like half a decade already, he decides to just completely abandon these two kids, Billy and his brother. But what he does is, and this is the reason that Billy's brother is essentially nowhere in history that like is relevant, is he gives them to two different foster families. He actually splits up the brothers, and then Billy's completely on his own. And that's kind of how he dives into the initial lifestyle of criminality.
I mean, and yeah, you could see it, right? Like even in modern day, not to paint a negative picture on people who come from these situations, because it's not their fault, but how often do you see deviant behavior? Like you see deviant behavior later in life from the people who had turbulent childhoods, right? You have, you maybe like the death of his mother, the loss of his father, the loss of his stepfather. He's got nobody now, right? Like this is a kid with no direction, right? Like when I was 13, half the time I barely knew if I could tie my shoes. I couldn't imagine being 13 in the middle of a place I didn't know, with nowhere to go, no way to get food, and it seems almost natural that his option is to be a criminal, right? Because who's going to give that guy an opportunity? They're going to see him just the way his stepfather saw him, which was a burden, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting. In all my research that I was doing for this podcast, I barely read any mention of this foster family he was given to. So it's my understanding that this foster family he was given also didn't really give a crap about him, because he just ends up on the streets and he's roaming around the prostitute district, and he's running errands for shady characters. And then as he's doing this to try to make ends meet, doing whatever odd tasks these sketchy individuals give him, he ends up, he gets recruited by this guy named Sombrero Jack, which is, first off, sweet nickname.
It's a pretty awesome name. I bet he has like a big mustache.
He better have had a big mustache. And it was funny, just to give a bit of pretext here, the story of Billy the Kid has a lot of different approaches to what happened. So a lot of people paint him as a guy that did nothing wrong. A lot of people paint him as a guy that did everything wrong. And we're going to try to skate the line and try to paint a decent picture of both of those things that happened, because some people say that Sombrero Jack was just Billy's friend and they just hung out, and then Sombrero Jack like gave him this stuff that he stole. But I've read that he was working with Sombrero Jack as a lookout, which is a lot more real. And it's, in my opinion, I think that's exactly what was going on.
100%, right? And like, after Billy obtained the weapon from, a revolver from the dealings with Sombrero Jacks and one of the many places that they robbed, or they staged I don't know what you would call it, a stick up at it, he was arrested, right? But he was a kid, so like even in today's life, like the sheriffs will say, hey, you know what, like you're a kid, you're misguided, you made a mistake, and they're gonna let him go. But what you see happens is Billy the Kid decides, you know what, I'm not going to wait for you guys to release me. I'm just going to leave, right? So when he is caught, when he is imprisoned, he then decides to get himself out of the situation. And I don't know about you, but if somebody's desperately trying to escape a prison cell, maybe they did something wrong, right? maybe they're not a complete victim in the situation.
Yeah, I don't
right?
believe for a second that Billy was just a complete victim in this situation, because he had it was Sombrero Jack had robbed this Chinese Chinese laundry worker, and
they have a washing machine.
Exactly. And he gives Billy all this crap, and then they search Billy's place of residence at the time, and they find this revolver that belongs to the Chinese man. And like Ashton touched on, it's assumed they weren't going to keep him in prison for very long. They were probably just giving him a slap on the wrist. But Billy doesn't hang around to figure that out, and he's this 15, 16-year-old kid. So he does this thing that is going to end up being really important in the future, where he convinces the sheriff, hey man, do you mind if I just like stretch my legs real quick? And the sheriff's like, okay, well the prison's locked, so I can let you out of your cell. You're not going to get anywhere. And he lets him out of his cell just because Billy's convinced him that he's just this kid and he's totally innocent. And Billy, with his tiny, slight frame, he ends up getting into the chimney and like scales the chimney. He gets onto the roof, runs across the roof, and he doesn't have a horse, he doesn't have anything, just runs out of town and escapes. And it's crazy, because if you think about the mind of a 15-year-old kid who's just broke out of prison, didn't really know what his sentence was going to be, in his brain, he's a fugitive now. He can't go home. He's on his own. And so he just starts running. He just gets out of town.
Yeah, and as we said earlier about the manifest destiny in terms of the term as it was used to move towards the frontier. Well, nowadays, like commonly, manifest destiny is meant as like think it and it'll come true, right? So you got to wonder if in Billy's mind he's thinking like maybe he hasn't actually done anything too crazy, worthy of being a criminal, worthy of being an outlaw. But now he's like, dude, I just escaped prison. Like I'm a badass, right? So now like he's convincing himself of this identity, and now he's going to act in a way that supports his newfound identity, right? Obviously, I'm speculating, but personally, as a former 16-year-old kid, 16-year-old male kid, mind you, I know exactly what that's like. Like you're kind of in that weird space where you're running on child software, but you got adult hardware, right? You got an adult body, but a child mind, and you don't really know who you are or what you are. And so when an opportunity like this presents itself to give him part of that identity, you can only imagine he literally runs with it.
Absolutely, right? And he's also, like you said, he's got a child brain, but he also now has adult responsibilities. He's got to keep care of himself. And it's kind of cool that you say that, because it's very soon that he starts to like operate with this swagger. And so he gets into this survival mode, and he ends up on foot traveling something like 500 miles. Now, there's no way to say that he didn't hitch a ride with someone along the way. There's no way to say that he didn't find some other means of transportation other than walking. But all we know is that somehow, traveling through the Midwest, foraging and stealing the things he needs, he makes it 500 miles, and he ends up in Camp Grant, Arizona.
It's possible that as the trope is, he hopped on a rail car, right? Because at this point, what was it? This would be what, 1865, 1866. At this point in the Americas, like due to this was right at the end of the Civil War, and the railroad was essentially, that was it's not like, hey, let's just go hop on a 737 and go to Camp Grant, Arizona. No, it's either you're going on horse and buggy, you're walking, or you're hopping on a rail car, right? So it's there is the possibility that makes it more plausible that he made that distance with a rail car, especially where he ended up, right? Like, because in order to ranch and move cattle, well, you're going to need a way to get that cattle going, and you're not going to run them like 2,000 miles, right? So it's possible that he did go by train car, but again, there's no, it's kind of that gray area where we know where he ended up, we don't necessarily know how he got there. Right?
Absolutely. There's no real documentation of this. We just know that he, as a 16-year-old, made it 500 miles, which is impressive in itself. But
Oh yeah.
When he gets to Camp Grant, he ends up right in these saloons, and this is where I talk about he starts operating with this swagger. He has this like signature red handkerchief that he wears around his neck, and he's becoming the kid. You know what I mean? He's becoming this gangster that he's trying to portray himself as. And that's probably a defense mechanism, man. You know, he was definitely scared. He's young. He's not some hardened criminal right now. This is all the beginning. He's not like this famous guy. He's absolutely fronting. And he's in these saloons, and he's got this one guy that just keeps picking on him. And remember, he's trying to establish himself as the cool guy. You know what I mean? He's a thug. And he's got this guy who's a local blacksmith named Frank Cahill. And he's been consistently bothering Billy, and he's been consistently giving him a hard time. And we don't know exactly what happened, but we know that Billy probably talked back to him eventually at one of these points. He says something, you know, I heard he said, "Hey, you son of a bitch," or something like that. He called him a name of some sort, and boom, they start fighting. And Cahill is a grown man, and Billy the Kid.
And a blacksmith.
Yeah,
those guys
exactly.
are jacked,
He's just he's a unit. And
imagine the forearms on that guy.
Oh my God, can you
man.
imagine just literally making metal swords all day?
Yeah. Yeah.
And not only is Billy 16, Billy's never big. There's no point in this story where Billy becomes a big guy. He's always small. And the pictures of him, the one known picture and the other couple pictures that are speculated to be him, he's small in all of them, man. Like, he's not a big guy. And Cahill ends up on top of him, and he's, you know, beating him up. And whether it's out of desperation or just to prove himself, Billy pulls his revolver that he's gotten pretty good with and blasts him in the stomach. And then he doesn't wait around. He bounces again. That's how he operates, right? At this point, Billy knows, hey, I just got to run. And he's gotten pretty good at it, honestly. And he hightails it. And he goes back to New Mexico.
This is where the kind of the myth began, right? Because you have you at this point now you got three different names for him, right? You got Billy the Kid, you got William H. Bonney, and then you got Henry McCarty, right? So who is this guy, right? You know, he's running all over. I suck with American geography. This is the South, right? This would be the South, kind of Southwest area. So he's running all around the Southwest, and, you know, maybe some people know him by William. Other people might know him as Henry, and then other people know him as the Kid. And then once this all gets found out, well, that's where the legend begins.
Yeah, well,
right?
he changes his name to William H. Bonney, which becomes his most famous name. He changes that because he wants to essentially become a new person to avoid getting in trouble for this murder. Right, because a bounty goes up for $500 to catch Henry McCarty for this murder. And then he just changes his name, and then Henry McCarty doesn't exist anymore. It's not like these guys have passport offices and pictures of you to know exactly who you are. So he's just Henry McCarty. Essentially, that's the end of Henry McCarty. He runs back to New Mexico, and he comes back, you know, however, a year and a half later as a completely different person. He's no longer Billy the Kid. And there's not many people to say, like, that's Billy the Kid. You know, there'd be a couple of guys in the neighborhood. And most of the guys that he was friends with were Hispanic people. So the guys that don't even speak English and definitely aren't in power in the neighborhood are the people that might know who he actually is. So he's able to blend back into New Mexico. Like, there's really not much talk about him getting in trouble for murdering the blacksmith at all. Like, I didn't see anywhere. Like, it's not, he doesn't get convicted of anything. He gets away with it pretty scot-free. And, you know, it was in self-defense. I don't think Cahill had any intention of killing him. But at the end of the day, he was getting his ass beat, and he killed a guy doing it. But that's the first blood on his hands. So now he's killed someone. Now he's a hardened killer, and he's not even 17.
It's also a bit of a testament to the world he was in, right? Like the lawlessness of the frontier, where like that's why they had the idea of the lawman. There wasn't police, there was a man and his deputies that enforced the law, and the law was whatever he said it to be. I know this becomes relevant in the story where there's speculation that he was actually friends with a certain lawman who may have had a hand in his demise. But the point being, like, you very well could have had a governor or the sheriff of that town get the details from somebody after the wanted poster's been put up and go, yeah, you know what, not worth pursuing. That sounds like he's a kid, he's backing himself up, and I knew that Frank guy, he's a bit of a dickhead, so, you know, and then Billy the Kid runs off.
Yeah,
right?
They definitely didn't have any sort of like deep-rooted justice system in place. It was a lot of just figuring it out as they went. That becomes important later in the story because, like, it's almost insane how discombobulated everything was, and how like backwards everything goes. Like there's one point where they're working for the law, and we'll get into it later because it kind of gets crazy because he ends up going back, and it's really important to paint the picture of what he goes back to in New Mexico. So what happens when he goes back is all these big time land speculators have started to move into the American frontier, and they're really starting to industrialize it. This is when they're starting to make train stations, and they're trying to make these massive monopolies on all the trade that's going on here. So these two Irish land speculators, and have come in and they've made Lincoln County into this massive cattle ranch, and they have this monopoly on all the cattle in Lincoln County, and they call themselves the House. And can you cover real quick who the House are?
Ominous. They were founded by two Irishmen, Lawrence Murphy and James Dolan. Lawrence Murphy came first. James Dolan was actually, he recruited him in, I believe it was 1874 as a business partner. And basically what these guys did, as Riley said, earlier in the podcast, actually, I alluded to the fact that there was these mass amounts of land that they were basically enticing people with, right? And it wasn't just poor peasants that came over and grabbed them. Of course, there was going to be some rich dudes like this who realized, okay, there's a big opportunity here, right? So they came over and they basically set up shop. They started cattle ranching, and they had a stranglehold on the local economy. And why that is because, you know, there's only so much cattle in one area, and there's a lot of demand. So if you're a poor farmer in the Lincoln County and you want to start your own farm to either supply, you know, whoever with heads of beef, well, now the House is going to show up and have something to say about it. Their primary client was actually the Union. It was the military, right? Because this was shortly after the American Civil War, and you know, war is expensive, and war takes up a lot of resources, and people need food. So they had all these cattle and all this land in this one area, and they were just basically strong-arming everybody into working with them or working for them, or, you know, disposing of them. And this is where John Tunstall enters the story.
Yeah, and the House is using these guys called the Seven Rivers Gang as their enforcers to protect their ranch and to persuade people to do business with them. And you couldn't get a more ominous group of guys to be your law enforcement. They literally are called a gang. It's in the name. They're not trying to hide this at all. The House has become so powerful. They've monopolized the entire area by, even like you were talking about, not only is it hard to get your own ranch started if you're just like a normal guy, but the House is going to come over here with a bunch of gangsters, give you a terrible deal, you know, pay you 50 cents on the dollar. And if you don't do it, they're going to shoot you straight in the face. And the House, they basically run the entire neighborhood. Like we were talking about earlier, there's not these like great law systems in place that are going to come protect you. You're pretty much screwed. So the House, they monopolize the entire area because they have no big competitors. And this is where John Tunstall comes in, because he's a big competitor.
Even if they didn't have big competitors too, right? Like the fact that the you know, air quotes law, the way it worked was that if you were a settler on this land, you needed to cultivate or work 160 acres and maintain that for 5 years, or purchase it after 6 months, right? So of course these guys, they can come in there, they've got all this money from previous industry experience, or whether, like, I think some of them were bankers and whatnot, and you know, they can just say, hey, 6 months, I just sat on that land, I'm buying it up, that plot's mine. But then there's also the problem, you know, when you have the Seven Rivers Gang enforcers, that you might have Joe Schmo over here with his farm and his family, and he's on year 4, right? And they know he's on year 4, and they know, hey, this is going to be a competitor. He's about to get this land granted to him. And as Riley said, that's when they show up with their police force, you know, Seven Rivers Gang, and say, hey man, your lease is up, right? This is our land now. And they say no, and then you know what happens next.
Exactly. But John Tunstall, he wasn't going to get pushed around. He's this 23-year-old British aristocrat with an amount of money that is unseen in the neighborhood. He's just coming in with cash. And it's interesting because this is how Billy the Kid comes back into this story. Because Billy the Kid, and this is also where I don't believe the Billy the Kid is this great guy narrative. Because Billy the Kid comes back to New Mexico and he doesn't try to get a job, doesn't try to do anything. He instantly just starts cattle rustling and horse wrestling. So his first instinct is to just start stealing horses and cattle. And if you don't think that that's a big deal, in the Midwest, horses and cattle rustling was like the epitome of big crime. That was not, like, that was just below murder. That was a huge deal. And Billy the Kid gets caught pretty quickly. He gets caught stealing horses. And just by an amazing stroke of luck, it turns out that Billy has stolen John Tunstall's horses. And John Tunstall is a really smart guy, and he's very resourceful. So he knows that the house has this great big Seven Rivers gang, and he's got to develop his own group of guys that's going to protect him, because this isn't normal business. This is the Wild West. And he sees Billy, this guy that's come back into town, has a bit of a reputation behind him now, and now he's in jail, and it's up to John Tunstall to press charges or to not press charges. So what does Tunstall do? He doesn't press charges. He lets Billy out scot-free, and he says, hey man, in return, come work for me. So not only does he let him out of jail, but he gives him a job right away. So now Billy's instantly super loyal to this guy. Here's this 17-year-old kid who's never had a grown male presence in his life give a crap about him. And all of a sudden he's got this guy that cares about him. And then he's got this group of guys that he's now working with that also all care about each other. So he's found his family.
And that's where the whole honor thing comes into, right? Because, you know, the name the Wild West doesn't really indicate that there's going to be knights on, you know, shining armor being chivalrous, but there is honor. It's bound to loyalty, right? You scratch my back, I scratch yours. Like, you know, maybe there's a lawman who, you know, an outlaw saves his life, so the next time the lawman runs across the outlaw, the lawman's going to turn the other cheek, because that's the kind of outlaw honor they have in the Wild West, right? It's the mutual respect and admiration and gratitude when somebody does something that they don't need to do, right? And this is exactly what happened with Tunstall, pulling him out of the depths, basically.
It's family, right? There's a lot of young men that don't have a family, and they're finding it with each other. That's why there's so many of these gangs. That's why there's so many of these weird groups of guys roaming around the countryside. And this group that Billy joins is called the Regulators. And man, I gotta say, every time I was reading the Regulators, I always just heard in my head Task Force, Regulators, you know, that used to play every day at our old Muay Thai gym. It's just an awesome little nostalgic moment for me. And so Billy's instantly in Tunstall's debt, and Tunstall starts doing really well. He starts building a pretty substantial cattle empire, and he seems to have an infinite supply of money. And it doesn't really detail where all this money is coming from, but he's British, man. He's like proper British. So he's got old money. And Murphy and Dolan are these two Irish cats who have never been given anything in their life. And they came to America to get away from British tyranny. And now this British guy is at their doorstep, taking what's, in their opinion, rightfully theirs. So this is an old beef. And Murphy and Dolan they're not too pumped about it. And I personally don't blame him. I get where they're coming from. But like Ashton said earlier in the podcast, you got to remember too, he's infiltrating a Irish area because people are moving where their ethnicity goes. And Tunstall's not really coming into a friendly work environment here. Most people are Irish. Most people are working with the house. And the house is pretty upset.
Yeah, and to the misfortune or fortune, depending on which side of the fence you're on. And this is an interesting thing about this story and the way it's framed, right? Because it makes it seem like, when you look at Billy the Kid is the protagonist. He's the primary figure of this tale. And Tunstall, you know, pulls him from the depths and says, hey, you don't have to rot in prison. You can come work for me. I'm giving you opportunity. But these guys are brand new to this place, right? Like these Irish folk have been here for however long, right? Like they've been kicking it there. This is their home. This is their industry. This is their business. They have ties to the government. It's like they have ties to the people. So it's very likely that when you look at the story from a different perspective, they're actually in the right. They're not the bad guys, right? But what we see here happens is these Irish fellows, they enlist the help of the local sheriff of the Lincoln counties, William Brady, right? And basically because, you know, the lawman is whoever's paying the lawman.
He's
the
also
lawman
Irish.
says
William Brady's hardcore Irish.
Yeah, exactly, right? So, you know, familial ties. They both don't like
Absolutely.
the British. They found something illegal with Tunstall and said, hey, we got to confiscate your property, right? You know, that something came up that, you know, he broke the law all of a sudden. And so they let him know.
just to reference how insane that is, that's like you finding something illegal in Steve Jobs' house and confiscating Apple. Okay, like they confiscate a massive cattle empire that he's developing, or they try to. They send him a court order that we're confiscating 500 cows from you because we found this irrelevant information about you. It's an insane court order. It's so blatantly corrupt that they're not even hiding how corrupt this is.
Yeah.
And
Tunstall.
Sorry, it's to the point where Tunstall thinks it's a mistake, right?
Yeah, exactly. Him being British, from the homeland, is, golly me, there's a mistake. He goes into town, and then he starts talking. He's like, hey guys, I think there's something wrong here, and the Wild West justice again, air quotes, is served, and he's shot dead, right? And
he's just walking. Apparently, he was like gliding into town, and back to the thing we were saying earlier. We don't really know how this went down, but I read somewhere that he was gliding into town. They saw him, and they're like, stop. And he just like kept coming towards them and being like, hey guys, what's going on? And then they just shot him dead. And then they come up and just execute his horse too, just to sort of like sprinkle salt on it. Like they're not hiding at all that they didn't like Tunstall. And they took a lawman who was barely a lawman, who is just some Irish guy that happened to become sheriff. And now they've murdered Tunstall.
Worthy of note, actually, he was $6,000 in debt to Dolan and Murphy, right? So that's that's a pertinent point that we almost missed. He's not so much a lawman as a hired gun with a badge, right? A little bit of clout. So and obviously you could see how this would upset the little family that Tunstall, I guess, had supported, right? And this is the thing about Cowboys I don't think a lot of people realize. I kind of alluded to this earlier in the episode, as did Riley, about the formation of familial ties. Is these guys, like, when going on a cattle run, right? Like when going out into the bush and reining up the cattle and bringing them back or sending them wherever, this wasn't a 1-day ordeal or a 2-day ordeal. This were 18-hour days, weeks at a time. You slept beside, you worked beside, some cases you died beside these guys, right? And not all of them got along, obviously, but they were a family, right? And as Riley said, this is how gangs were formed. So you can understand how this is going to enrage all of the regulators, right? Like Tunstall's group.
Absolutely. Yeah. Crazy, man. 6,000. That's like $150,000 in debt in today's money.
How do you spend that much? Like how?
Impossibly in debt. He's probably around the prostitutes and the bars, you know what I mean? Just being an idiot.
Poker, yeah.
And like you touched on though, man, like the regulators, this is not just their boss. This guy means more to them than that. He's opportunity. He's hope. He's this guy that came in and gave them all a job and started developing something. And he's not the house who they probably had beef with at the time already and didn't get along with. He's opportunity, and he's an alternative to the life they've already been living. And the regulators are infuriated. And they make a pact to avenge Tunstall's death. And then they go to the Justice of the Peace, and they get themselves deputized. And they issue a warrant to arrest the murderers of Tunstall. So they use a bit of legal trickery to sort of somehow make themselves deputies, which really shows how insane the justice system is in the Wild West at the time, where you can just go get a group of gangsters deputized. Because
legal vigilante justice.
Yeah, literally, because you're like, this happened. Like, give us a badge and a warrant, and we'll go execute it. And among the people that they have a warrant of arrest for is Sheriff William Brady. So they actually have legal justification to go after Sheriff Brady, and that's exactly what they do. So.
Worthy of note here too is there's a leader of the regulators, and it isn't Billy the Kid, right?
So
kind of like what Riley was saying.
He's not even one of the top 5 members of the group.
Exactly. So kind of like what Riley was saying earlier, right? Like you have this important like mythical figure in history, but like, this guy's kind of a scrub, right? Like he's cool. He's got a cool story so far, but he's kind of bottom rung in this game. But he's just gang, and he's just kind of along for the ride, and he just so happens to be there when these things occur, right?
Yeah, he's just kind of showed up at the time. We'll get to the guy's name here in a second who actually runs the gang, but Billy's there for sure, and he's with them in all of this, and he's still an important player in it, but he's by no means in charge of the gang. He's just sort of along for the ride. And he's got some blood on his hands already. They know who he is. He has a bit of a reputation in the gang, but by no means is he making the shot. Is he calling the shots? But he's there when they ambush William Brady, the sheriff. And they just kill the sheriff. They don't really try to arrest him. That didn't happen. And Billy actually gets shot in the thigh during the shootout with Sheriff Brady and the other couple of deputies that were there. And then, so that's the first important act of the Lincoln County War. And that's what we're going to get into next. Is there's this war that happens in Lincoln County, and it's a civil war, and it's by no means a legal war. It's really just gangsters fighting each other, but they're fighting each other on a scale that in history it's considered a war. And that's the first major point. That's the first blood spilled is on Tunstall, but of the war, the first blood spilled is this ambush of William Brady. And then the regulators go off, and they go off to this other place they call Blazer's Mill. And they go there to find this guy called Buckshot Roberts, who was apparently there when Tunstall was killed. And remember, the regulators weren't there when Tunstall was killed. Tunstall was on his own when he got murdered. So they're operating off of some, pretty much nothing, really. They're operating off of the guys they know that Sheriff Brady hung around with. And one of those guys is Buckshot Roberts. And it's pretty well known that Buckshot Roberts wanted nothing to do with this. He was actually on his way to collect his money for selling his property. And he's about to move out of New Mexico because he can tell that some problems are brewing. And he's like, I don't want to be part of this. And he's on his way out. First off, another amazing nickname. I think that's the best part about this podcast so far is all the awesome nicknames. And Buckshot Roberts goes down like a man. Buckshot Roberts, he gets shot, and then he climbs over to this little bunker he sets up. And as he's hiding there, he kills one of the regulators, and then the leader of the regulators comes around and tries to kill him. Buckshot Roberts shoots him in the face, and then the regulators have to retreat. So Buckshot Roberts, he fends off the 12 regulators that are there. Ends up dying of his wounds about a day later. But now there's been...
Hell of a way to go.
I know, right? But it's this awesome shootout. And now there's been a couple big incidents that have happened in the war.
Yeah, so now you're the governor of the territory, and you're like, excuse me, what? So these guys that they came and, they convinced me that they could be deputized, that they were going to enforce the law. What you're telling me, they just killed a sheriff, and then they just went and tried to lynch this guy? And hold on here. Hold on a minute, right? So then he revokes their deputization, and he starts pounding out these warrants for members of the regulators, and it just so happens one of them was on Billy the Kid. And this is important because, if he was unimportant, but he was a part of it, right? Because imagine if they didn't put a warrant on Billy the Kid. It might have just stopped right there. It might have been, the end of a John Wayne movie where he rides off into the sunset, Billy the Kid's no more, right? He's not hunted. He doesn't have to fear anything. But again, seems to be the theme in his life is he's always persecuted, right? And now he needs to up the ante further. So you can imagine being in his position thinking, all of these steps have led him now to here, and he's justified in his actions in his mind, and now he's being persecuted further, which then means that his actions need to get more and more intense, right? Or what's the alternative, right? He gets shot and killed.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to how personable Billy the Kid was. Not only is this still a famous story that we talk about to this day, but when he escaped prison, it was because he talked his way out of it, and he was like, hey man, I'm just this 16-year-old kid, don't worry about it. And he's well liked with everyone he meets. He's a personable guy, so he's known in everything he's doing. So even though he was one of 11 regulators that killed Sheriff Brady, people are going to know, hey, was Billy the Kid there? Yeah, Billy the Kid was there. You know what I mean? Okay, well, even if, he was there. But even if he wasn't there, they still might have put a warrant out for his arrest because he was such this well-known guy. And he had his red handkerchief, and he posed with his rifle for pictures, and he was this...
It's a good PR win.
Yeah, he was a character, that's for sure. But unfortunately, it wasn't the PR that you want. But after this happens, after their deputization's been revoked, which just speaks to how ridiculous it is, because they're like, hey, you're the law, and then this other guy comes in and goes, no, you're not the law, and it's this big conflict that's going on that's labeled a war, but it's not a war, and it's legal, and then it's not illegal, and it's just this whole hodgepodge of insane events that just proving how disorganized the West is at the time, and proving that, really, in my opinion, at this point, no one's in the wrong. Billy the Kid and the regulators, they were perfectly in the right to seek vengeance on their buddy who got wrongfully murdered by Sheriff Brady. The problem is the way they seek vengeance is just by killing the guy and then killing his buddies. And they actually ended up capturing a couple other members of the Seven Rivers gang, and then they make up this story that they tried to escape and they shoot them 11 times, one for every regulator. And it's like, okay, were they trying to escape or did you just all execute them together? Which is much more likely is what happened, because it was said that the guy they murdered, Morton was his last name. It didn't make sense that he was going to try to escape. So like Ashton was saying, they get their deputization revoked because it's become pretty clear pretty quickly these guys aren't acting within the law, in the sense of they're cutthroats, man. They're gangsters, and they're operating as gangsters, and they're seeking absolute vigilante vengeance / justice. So it's definitely not just like this just action. And there's a lot of historians, when it comes to Billy the Kid, a lot of historians have fallen in love with the character of him. And when I was watching it, a lot of these guys, and when I was reading about it, a lot of the guys that have written or have spoken about Billy the Kid, they justify his actions pretty romantically. And I really disliked that, because there's not really any evidence ever that Billy the Kid is this great Robin Hood character striving for good. And something that bothers me is actually, I think that in history, we paint people as either good or evil. We want one or the other. Billy the Kid wasn't a good man. He wasn't a bad man. Billy the Kid was a survivor. He showed it over and over again. Billy the Kid proved he was a survivor when he traveled 500 miles. But there's no evidence that he was some good guy. There's no evidence that he was some great character. There's a couple of good things that he did, and he looked out for his regulators, and he looked out for his family. But he was just a survivor, and I think that that's kind of the end of it. I mean, as far as he goes,
it's
as
incredibly
a character, right?
But I'm glad you brought up like the binary between good and evil, right? Because like I can speak for myself, and I'm sure for Riley as well. We've all done things that you might be viewed as reprehensible from the outside, but we've also probably done things that were viewed as very good. The part that's missing when you look at history so often is you just look at the facts and then you make your own judgment without recognizing the human element of the motivation, right? Like Riley said, man, like I don't know about you guys, but I would be pretty pissed off if I was in prison and somebody came and said, hey, man, you're going to come out of prison. You're going to have a job. I'm going to give you a family. And then some dude walked up and shot him in the face. Right? I don't think I'd be happy with that. So certainly Billy the Kid did bad things, right? But he was put in bad situations, right? And what's the alternative? Like every single human being alive will do what is necessary to continue their life, right? And it just so happened that in the game of history, Billy the Kid was put in multiple situations where he, for lack of a better term, he won, but you can't imagine that he was sitting there thinking, oh boy, I hope they issue a warrant for me so I can go kill more sheriffs, yeah. Right?
I mean, man, if I was a 17-year-old kid stuck in prison and this guy came and didn't break him out, but and gave me a second chance and gave me a job, that guy would have been like God. You know what I mean? He would have been this amazing character. So it's totally understandable that Billy's pissed. It's totally understandable that he wants vengeance. And now, to get back to the story, the regulators, they've lost their deputization. They are no longer legal in their actions, but they're not done by any means. And the war is about to climax, because 50 to 60 regulators, that's how big of a group these guys have come to. A lot of them were Mexican Americans or Hispanic people living in New Mexico at the time. About 30 of them were, 20 or 30 of them were. So they're all close friends with Billy. And they head into Lincoln, and they set up all over the town. And then the Seven Rivers gang and the house and everyone else that works for the house sort of surround them in this big U around the city. And they've got this multiple day standoff going on. And there's a new sheriff who's been replaced, Sheriff Pepin. And so this standoff's going down. There's a couple pot shots shot at each other. I think one or two people actually get killed in this time of standoff. And then so Pepin, he sends a message over to Colonel Dudley, who, remember, the house is supplying the Union with food. So they're using their resources here. And they go and they ask Colonel Dudley if he can help. And initially he refuses, and then magically overnight he changes his mind. So, who knows what happened there, but I'm sure the house nudged him in the right direction and that his soldiers might accidentally run out of food really quick for a minute. Who knows? But at the end of the day, Colonel Dudley shows up with some soldiers, and this breaks the stalemate almost instantly. He's got trained professional soldiers showing up, and they end up cornering the regulators into this one building. They back them in, and it's still a big stalemate, still quiet over the town. And then all of a sudden, just a barrage of gunfire erupts. And they're blasting at each other left, right, and center. No one's getting hit, surprisingly. And then this deputy sheriff and another man, they come around the side using the cover of gunfire, and they light fire to the building that the regulators are in. And during this shootout, they get really close. Now there's a fire raging, and McSween, who's now the leader of the regulators after the last one was killed by Buckshot Roberts, he gets killed. So somehow the regulators' leaders have a tendency to be the only guys that get killed. But after this climaxes, and you know what? We did brush over it, but the war in total took about 70 people's lives. So a lot of people died. But major players, only about 4 or 5 major players died during the conflict. And this is the end. As the building's on fire, as multiple people have been killed in this big shootout, all the regulators escape. And they escape out the back. And then McSween, their leader's dead. They've clearly lost the battle. And they don't have a job anymore. Tunstall's dead. So this is where Billy and the regulators split up. And they go their separate ways.
So now you got him back to being an outlaw, right? And this is when, naturally the state is going to intervene. You're like, dude, what? You just pulled the military in here? Like, okay, well, we gotta go and do something with this situation, right? So there was a new governor, and by the name of Lew Wallace, and he basically said, okay, this is getting out of hand. You guys we got to figure this out, right? So he looked at who are the usual suspects, I guess you could say, the easy people who he could target, and Billy the Kid happened to be one of those. So there was an indictment out for Billy, another warrant essentially, and Billy, being the cunning man he was, decided, you know what, I don't want to be a wanted man. I don't want to be on the run again. So he offered to testify against members of the House.
Yeah.
And
to intervene really quickly, Lew Wallace comes in as the new governor because obviously the previous governor did not have the state of New Mexico under control. So Lew Wallace's first job is to get control. And how's one way you got to get control in a situation like the Lincoln County War is you have to pick a side. You have to pick which side was correct, because that's the only way you're going to be able to enforce anything, because you don't actually have any means of enforcing anything yourself. It's the Wild West. So you have to pick guys to enforce for you. And he's picking between two evils here. He's deciding either I'm going to deal with the regulators or I'm going to deal with the House. Now the House actually has money. They have a leader, and they didn't kill any sheriffs. So he picks the House. And the rest of the regulators, they just bounce. They're gone. They leave. They probably headed to Arizona or somewhere else. We don't really hear from them again. So Lew Wallace, he needs to figure out what just went down. He needs to figure out what's going on. And the regulators are gone. But Billy, for some reason, seems very keen on staying in New Mexico. And that's where he does what Ashton just said, where he sends a letter to Lew Wallace. Lew Wallace is coming in, doesn't know what's going on, and then he gets this random letter from a character named William H. Bonney, who we know as Billy the Kid. And he does exactly what Ashton just said. He offers to testify against members of the House and the leaders of the House. And he says, in response to this testification, I want full-on amnesty, right?
Which is interesting, right? Because this is the beginning of anything that might be seen as something greater than a kangaroo court of a he said, she said, right? Like he's like, hey, I'll give you my side of the story. Let them give you theirs as well. As opposed to, hey, you know what? These guys are more established. They're contributing to the economy. They have a leader and they have a group. We're going to go with these guys. It doesn't matter what happened to you guys, right? You guys are now wanted. This is simple for me. Because now he's opening the door for the opportunity for some legitimate justice and not Old West justice. But unfortunately, after Billy testifies, which he does, he lives up to his part of the deal. The governor just, for some reason, didn't stick around to see it through. The man who gave him this opportunity wasn't there when Billy came to testify. So the judge, we got so close to legitimate justice and legal system, but then the judge is like, you know what, man, I'm just going to do what I want to do anyway, right? So that he doesn't comply with the governor's orders, and it was left up in the air. And so naturally, again, they say, hey, you know what, we're going to go back on this, Billy, we're coming after you again, right? So he's gotten good at it at this point, so Billy flees town again.
Yeah, and like you said, Governor Lew Wallace just bounces. He's nowhere to be found once Billy actually does his once Billy actually testifies, and he's probably off writing Ben-Hur, which is a pretty famous book that Lew Wallace ends up writing. But not just that, it's I'm hopping right back into speculation here. It's said that Lew Wallace might have actually told the judge to pardon Billy the Kid, but the judge was kind of pissed off that Wild West justice was going on, and he probably saw that as an extension of that, of giving this cop killer amnesty just because he's going to come in and testify. He's probably like, that's ridiculous. So yeah, the judge doesn't comply at all. So whether it was Lew Wallace who didn't live up to his side of the bargain, or it was the judge that didn't live up to Lew Wallace's request, we don't know. In my opinion, it was a bit of both, because as we go on, we'll see more about Lew Wallace's actions and how he dealt with the situation. And none of it really sides with the fact that he was this honorable guy that was living up to his side of the bargain. But that is possible. It's possible that it was just the judge didn't want to go along with what Lew Wallace asked him to do.
I mean, with Occam's razor, usually the most simplest explanation is the one that was most likely to be true, right? People like to do things that are easy, especially guys who are going and writing great works of literature.
Yeah.
So he probably looked at the situation. He's like, he might have just said, hey, this is a good way to get this guy in here, and then you guys put him in shackles and we're done with this, right? Now I can look like I solved a problem and have my political clout, right? Because it's the game of politics. So it's very likely, that he, again, speculating that, there was really no hope of amnesty for Billy, which, contributes to why some believe it maybe was a tragedy, the story of his life, and not so much that he was a malicious outlaw that orchestrated all these things and got justice of what was coming to him. Rather, he was a misled kid put into poor situations who eventually had an untimely end, right?
Yeah, and I think that whole situation is evidence that Billy probably genuinely believed that he was in the right, and that he was doing the right thing, because that was a massive risk to go back into town and to testify when you're a wanted man and you have warrants out for your arrest. You could look at it in the sense that...
Takes grapes.
Absolutely. You could look at it in the sense that he wanted to get amnesty. Maybe that was the way he was looking at it. But you could also look at it into the sense where he genuinely believed we did the right thing. We were operating legally, and we wanted to get vengeance for a murder on my boss. And that's what he was motivated by. We can't know what he was motivated by. But to say that he could have just bounced, all the other regulators are gone. There's nowhere in history that no one else gets tried in court. No other regulators are tried in court. Only Billy the Kid ends up being tried in court. So it's easy to say that he could have just left. He could have been gone forever. But for some reason, he's attached to New Mexico. And we'll get into that.
And to be fair, he, like you said, he was a kid, so maybe he was bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and thinking that this was the noble and courageous thing to do. But technically speaking, they were deputized and they did have a warrant, right? So it wasn't like it was completely outlandish, like they ganked him in the back alley. So it's, it could be that, because he also, what was he 20, 19 at this time? He was still pretty young.
He's 20
right?
yet, no. Yeah, he's like 19.
Yeah, so he's a kid,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, so he's an absolute kid, where all the other regulators might be, maybe they're a bit older, like, dude, you're crazy, right? Like, I'm going to Arizona, you know what I mean? And Billy's like, no, we can win this war, real idealistic and whatnot. And,
Who knows?
We know how that ends.
Absolutely, we do know how that ends, unfortunately. But that does touch on the point that there's no reason to believe that Lew Wallace, an established governor of New Mexico, famous guy, older, had any reason to believe that he was going to respect this 19-year-old kid that had murdered a sheriff. Lew Wallace doesn't have any attachment to Billy the Kid, and there's no reason to believe that Lew Wallace believes that he's being dishonorable by not honoring what he said to Billy. It was probably to him like this white lie where he's like, whatever. Oh, okay, sure, I'll give you amnesty, buddy. And then he just had every intention of capturing and killing him. That's a total other possibility.
You could imagine him sitting there just like drinking his tea, reading the letter, and he's like, dude, he's going to come to us.
Yeah, he's probably like, oh,
like,
sick. Yeah. Oh, you're going to, yeah, I'll give you amnesty, Billy. Come right on in. But to get back to this.
But yeah,
continue.
Yeah, so Billy, again, he decides to flee. Man, this guy is so good at running. Like he escapes everything. Yeah. But yeah, so he decides to flee, and this is a really questionable part of his story is, after everything that's been thrown his way, all the obstacles and like just the state of New Mexico at this point where like he is now like there's going to be no there's going to be no vindication for him. There's probably not going to be the opportunity for him to stand on top and say, I'm right. You know what I mean? But he decides to remain in New Mexico anyway. And this I can't really wrap my head around why this makes sense, but he decides to go back to horse rustling and cattle rustling, and in New Mexico, whose horses and whose cattle is that? Like, I'm laughing because of the absurdity. Well, it's the house, right? So he escapes town, but then he's like, you know what, guys? I'm just gonna go mess around with your horses, right? Take that. That's his justice.
I love it, man. This is why Billy the Kid's a great character, because he just wouldn't leave it alone. He absolutely had a pair of cojones on him. You know what I mean? This guy was dragging his nuts everywhere he went, because every other regulator runs away. But Billy the Kid, he goes back to cattle rustling, which, by the way, he wasn't good at. He got caught within 2 months the first time he did it. So what does he do? He gets caught again because he's not great at cattle rustling.
Because he's Billy the Kid.
I think I'm going to chalk that part up to personal beef against the house. I think that he was trying to stick it to the house one last time, steal a couple of their cows, and hang around. He obviously is attached to New Mexico at this point. He obviously doesn't want to relocate again. But I do find it pretty hilarious that he goes back to cattle rustling as if that was like a good plan the first time he tried it. And there's this new sheriff in town, Pat Garrett. And Pat Garrett wants to make a name for himself. He's got this big bounty on the head of Billy the Kid. It's a win-win. So Pat Garrett makes it his sole mission to go catch Billy. And it's important to note, too, at this time, the house and the news, which is just owned by the house, they're pinning pretty much everything wrong in the neighborhood on Billy the Kid, right? So it's the Wild West. There's plenty of crime. There's plenty of murder. But they want to paint the picture that it's all just this one amazing outlaw committing all these crimes, because that gives people hope that once he gets caught, everything will be good. Everything will be fine and dandy. Lincoln County will be this perfect place, this beautiful haven of safety. And
Irish paradise.
Exactly, right? And so that is a really important point, because that's why Billy's so famous. At the end of the day, he's just an interesting character that did some crazy stuff. But his fame came from the fact that they painted him as this amazing outlaw causing all the problems in the neighborhood. He was the sole villain of the entire Lincoln County at this time. But that really blows up in his face, right?
It's a little ironic how now he is a part of history when they tried to make him look like he was the grand villain, right? So it's like the guys orchestrating the narrative made the narrative out to make it. In a way, they kind of made Billy look like the victim, right? Like for us at least, right? Because now we can see it retrospectively. But yeah, it's easy to paint a boogeyman, right? Especially a well-known boogeyman like the Kid.
Yeah, exactly, right. And so Pat Garrett, he's obsessed with catching Billy the Kid, and it doesn't take him long. He finds Billy the Kid in, 1 second here, I'm just going to find it, because he finds him in a specific place.
Stinking Springs.
Yeah, there it is. Yeah, so he finds him in Stinking Springs, and he transports him back to Fort Sumner. And Billy's put on trial for the murder of Sheriff Brady, and he's sentenced to death. And that's what I was saying earlier about how no other regulator was put on trial for anything. No other regulator was caught alive and tried except for Billy the Kid. And I think that's why it's adds to his fame even more, because now he's the only guy in this entire war that actually had any news afterwards. Everyone else just smoke bombed and they were gone. But now this is this continuation of this battle, and he's the only guy that actually gets tried. And when that happens, there's a sort of idea that happens culturally where you sort of forget everything else that happened and you just blame it all on that one person. Now the whole war is this guy's fault and they've caught him and they've brought justice to this entire conflict. Did they really bring any justice to the conflict? Not even a little bit. Everybody involved, essentially, either the couple leaders that got killed, but the rest of them got away, except for Billy the Kid. So it's back to hope by the people in the area at the time. And I think that that's why the story of Billy the Kid unravels so dramatically in history as something completely different than how it was being portrayed at the time. Going back and reading over it again, it really isn't anything like what they were saying it was at the time. They were trying to paint him as this like horrible villain. He really wasn't. He was just this kid that got lost, got caught up with a group of people that he really liked, and was on the wrong side. He was on the losing side. History is written by the victor, right? If the regulators had won, I guarantee they would not have been de-deputized. They would have been painted as the rightful guys in the thing, and it would have gone back to normal. But they didn't. They lost.
They would have been Irish tyrants monopolizing cattle ranch, oppressing the civilian populace, not allowing growth to occur. And that's just... like you said, history is written by the victors, right? And I find it interesting because we talked about the romanticization of Billy, and even in the way we speak about him, we do kind of romanticize it and see him as this helpless victim, right? Like it's easy to, because it's curious how like the big man puts the heel down on the little guy, right? But it's not like he's entirely blameless, right?
Yeah, I definitely agree with what you're saying there. I try my best not to romanticize Billy, but it's impossible. Even in history, he's still a charming guy. He still tugs at the right heartstrings. And I think that it comes down to what happens next. Because Billy has been sentenced to death. He's going to hang. And being the escape artist he is, he pulls it off again. You want to detail a little bit how he pulls this off, Ashton?
Yeah, so Billy is... he's in the prison cell, and there's one deputy in there with him, and he says, "Hey man, like I really got a piddle, right?" So he asks the guard, "Can I go to the bathroom?" The guard does, and bear in mind, Billy was a skinny guy, so maybe these shackles were meant for big blacksmiths like Frank Cahill. He escaped the shackles, got into a little jiu-jitsu match with the guard, got him to the ground, took the pistol, and lights out for the guard. He's stuck in this sheriff's office. He's like, "Okay, I got one dead dude and I got one pistol. What am I supposed to do here?" He runs upstairs. He gets higher ground, finds a more powerful weapon. He finds a shotgun, and lo and behold, the other guard conveniently is walking across the street after having lunch, probably at a local saloon, and Billy waves at him, "Hello, Bob," and then boom, shotgun right to the chest. Right, knocks that guy out. And Billy hops on a horse and he, skips town one more time. This is we're reaching the end of the saga, and just know that this is his last great escape, or was it? We'll get to that. But a fun note on Billy the Kid and how many times he's escaped, and I think it's interesting how we sympathize with him and how it wasn't just us, but lots of people in his time did as well. And it was said that he had these this is such a weird thing to say, but it said that he had these deep blue beautiful eyes, right? Like that he was a good looking kid with these big blue beautiful eyes, and that people couldn't help but look at him and be like, "Oh, you poor thing," right? Like feel for him, sympathize with him because of the way he looked, right? So this guy could have, for all we know, he could have been a malicious psychopath, but he had these marbles in his head that people thought were windows to his soul, and that his soul was pure, and that very well may have aided him in the first place, managing to get into the chimney, and now in this place managing to convince the guard to let him go to the bathroom, because people are more inclined to do nice things for people they deem attractive, I guess.
100%. It's cool. There's one confirmed picture of Billy the Kid that everyone knows is Billy the Kid. In my opinion, he looks pretty rough in the picture. But there's a lot of other pictures that are much more clear that are suspected to be Billy the Kid, and they would do these things where they would face match, and they've done a lot of historical stuff that says that they're most likely Billy the Kid. And if they're not, they're someone who looks really similar to how he would have looked. And those pictures, man, he's a handsome young guy for sure. So yeah, sure, if you look him up on the internet, that one picture that comes up it's tough. You know what I mean?
That's the one with him holding his rifle, right?
That's the one we know as him.
Yeah.
He looks horrible in that picture,
Yeah.
but I saw a couple others. There's one where he's playing, I don't know, he's playing some game, but he's standing there with a couple of the other regulators. He looks really good. He's a young, put-together guy. And then there's another one where he's in his suit, and he's got another regulator with him, and they've got these top hats on. And that one, it's not sure at all that it's him, but that's a really good-looking young man. So I think that... What's up?
I'm glad that we're bringing up the pictures, because on this note, there is one picture where it's speculated that Billy the Kid is on the far left in the picture, and on the far right, it is none other than Pat Garrett, the sheriff that is now in the process of hunting him down, right? So that adds another little layer of mystique to this story, right? Because why were they together in this photo, if that was in fact Billy the Kid? I think it's established that it is Pat Garrett, but... You know, maybe we'll get to this once we talk about the final act here, but it kind of adds a whole another layer, another dimension of mystery to this story. And all we can do is speculate, because there's like the record kind of dies off after this, but it's, you know, yeah, we'll get to it. So what happened? What was his fate, Riley? What happened to Billy?
Yeah, well, I wanted to touch back really quickly on that last escape, because as Ashton said, when he killed the guard initially, no one saw him kill the first guard. So it's kind of speculated how he wrestled the gun off of him. But like the entire town square saw this guy run up, yell at the other guard who's running back to see him and say, "Hello, Bob," and then blow his brains out. And that's the first time that of all the murders that Billy the Kid committed, that it's clear that it was like cold-blooded. He just blasted this dude. And you could say, oh, this is proof that Billy the Kid was a bad guy all along. And I would actually probably agree with you that it is proof that Billy the Kid wasn't a good character, that he wasn't a good guy. Like I said, I just think he's a survivor the whole time. But it is definitely proof that at this point in his life, man, he's a ruthless guy. At this point in his life, Billy the Kid's a full-on gangster. He's a full-on... he's a killer. He's an outlaw, man.
He's an outlaw.
Billy the freaking Kid at this point. He's not that kid hanging out with the Hispanic guys at 15 anymore. He's a totally different person. And that's how life happens, man. But he gets on a course and he skips town again. And this is the part of the story that's wild, because he does not leave New Mexico. He stays. Are you nuts? What are you doing, man? It's crazy. He completely could have got away with this whole thing, okay? He could have just traveled 2,000 miles, or he could have just gone to Mexico. He could have left. He could have been scot-free. They did not have these detailed methods of catching people back at this time, man. He totally could have got away with it. He could have changed his name a third time, but he doesn't. He stays in New Mexico. It's rumored that he had fallen in love, and guys do stupid stuff when they fall in love, right? So he's hanging out with this 16-year-old. Whatever. It's back in the day. I guess that was completely understandable. He's fallen in love with this 16-year-old, and he's staying with her, and he's being supplied by her brother, who is not exactly pumped that his little sister is fallen in love with one of the most famous outlaws in the entire country, and now he's keeping it a secret. And a lot of people, because this part of the story isn't, again, for sure, a lot of the people just say that Pat Garrett received tips that Billy the Kid was in this one neighborhood. I totally believe that it was the brother that told Pat Garrett where Billy the Kid was, because Pat Garrett found out the exact building that Billy the Kid was in. If you receive a couple anonymous tips that he's in this area, you're not going to go to the exact building that Billy the Kid's in. But that's exactly what Pat Garrett does. And at this point...
He went there like straight away, like a cruise missile.
Yeah, he didn't like look around the town, nothing. He completely went exactly to the right building. And Pat Garrett, he's not interested in capturing Billy anymore. Billy's escaped 3 times. That's rung up. There's a $5,000 bounty on Billy the Kid, okay? That's like Sheriff William Brady's debt to the house. You know, it's a ton of money. And so Pat Garrett, 1, he's looking to make a name for himself. 2, he's looking for that paycheck. 3, the trial's already happened. They know they're going to hang him anyways. So let's skip a step. Pat Garrett's there to kill Billy the Kid. And Pat Garrett he goes and he sends 2 of his deputies around to the front door. And then he goes and he sneaks in the back door of this building. And Billy the Kid hears a commotion, sees a couple guys out at the front door. He draws his pistol and he walks forward, and then in Spanish he says, "Who's that?" And it's one of the first time in Billy's life that he decides not to pull the trigger. And he says, "Who's that?" And then he backs away from the door, and he walks into the bedroom. And Pat Garrett's sitting right there, lying on the bed, pistol aimed at the door, doesn't say a word, shoots Billy twice in the chest. And that's the end of Billy the Kid as we know. And it's interesting because we've watched so many Western movies that nowadays we think that the only honorable way is to invite him out for a duel or something like that. And Pat Garrett got a lot of bad press for killing him in just cold blood, essentially. But that's ridiculous.
Would you not?
That's exactly what I would have done.
How many cops has he killed?
3,
now? 3?
yeah.
4, right? Yeah, and that's excluding just civilians and other people as well. So obviously this guy's lethal, right? He like you said, he blasted a dude in the town square in the middle of daylight, right? Like just relentless. So
he wrestled a guy.
He broke
out of his cuffs, wrestled a guy, took his gun, and killed him. He's a killer. He's a dangerous criminal. Yeah. He's got tons of experience killing people. It said he had up to 21 kills at this point. Yeah. What is Pat Garrett going to do?
I think that's...
Challenge him to a duel. You're going to lose, man. It's Billy the frickin' Kid. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Quick draw.
Yeah.
But I think that's kind of it, right? That's the life and times and the tragic end of Billy the Kid, the outlaw who's simultaneously the victim of circumstance. Or was it? You know? And this is where the fun part of Billy the Kid comes into play, because there's speculation that Billy finally wisened up and he's like, maybe I should leave New Mexico, right? So there's speculation that on that night, remember what I said about Pat Garrett being in a photo with Billy the Kid, allegedly, right? Well, now were that the case, and again, tying this all together, remember what I said back earlier about honor, right? So perhaps, Pat Garrett was one of the regulators, or, he ran with one of the crews that Billy did. And at this point, he got put into a position where he could take out Billy the Kid. And, maybe he goes into this house, he sees Billy, and he's sitting there on the bed with his gun pointed at him. And instead of just pop, taking out Billy, he says, "Billy, I'm giving you one option, right? You need to leave, right?" And then maybe they grab some other fellow, or who knows, right? Who knows who the body they bring or whatnot, but maybe Billy escapes. Maybe he did have that Cowboy movie John Wayne moment where he bids farewell to Paulita and he rides off into the sunset towards Texas, right? And there's people who have claimed to be him. There was a man in, believe it or not, because this seems so weird to people when they look at the time frame of history, in the 1950s, right? Bear in mind, Billy was born in 1859. So the 1950s, he would be, was that 91? Plausible. There was a man who was going in New Mexico who went to the justice system asking for a pardon for Billy the Kid, right? Claiming to be Billy the Kid. So now imagine that it was said that he was sticking with the theme, a rancher and a farmer, right? That's a pretty cool story if you ask me. And as much as I know I shouldn't, I want to believe that's the case, because that's Hollywood stuff, right? Like that's the cool who knows part of history, right?
Yeah, I mean, for all intents and purposes, Billy's dead. If you're writing a history essay on Billy the Kid right now and you're listening to this podcast, Billy's freaking dead. Pat Garrett killed him. Yeah. But it's a super fun
also,
to speculate,
don't use us,
yeah, don't use us as a reference.
Yeah, don't use us as your sources. Otherwise, you're going to have dude a lot in your essay. Yeah.
But it is definitely fun to speculate on Billy the Kid. And he was such an amazing character that, of course, he could have got away with it. And Pat Garrett is assumed to have been a really respectable guy. Everyone thought that he was a really respectable sheriff. He lived on to live a good life. But this could have happened, man. This guy could have been Billy the Kid. There's about 10 people that claimed to be Billy the Kid. But
I think there was 2 that were like, yeah, okay, maybe.
That it was a bit legitimate. And that guy, actually, he asked for on his tombstone for Billy the Kid to be put on his tombstone. Was he just some crazy old man? Maybe. Maybe not. Maybe it was freaking Billy the Kid.
1950s cosplay.
Yeah, exactly. Just this old dude that was tired of his life and wanted to go out as a legend. No, man, it doesn't really make sense why someone would pretend to be Billy the Kid. Why 10 people would pretend to be Billy the Kid really doesn't make sense. But there is absolute cause to believe that he could have escaped. I think so. He escaped 3 times. And, like you said, maybe Pat Garrett did do that thing in that room. Or maybe Pat Garrett killed the wrong guy and saw a $5,000 paycheck and was like, well, I'm getting my freaking paycheck and I just shot someone. So let's pretend it was Billy the Kid. It was nighttime in some random house. Like we said, Pat Garrett didn't get the house wrong even once. And he assumed, based on this Spanish that he didn't speak, that Billy the Kid was the guy that had said who's there and shot him. So it totally could
And you
happen.
never know too, right?
Dude, $5,000 is
imagine...
$100,000. Maybe, okay.
Yeah.
Do whatever. Go to Google. I don't know exactly, but I know that it's a lot
It's
of
a
money.
lot.
It's not $5,000.
And it's not outside the realm of possibility that this Pat Garrett, like we said, the honor between cowboys, right? And maybe Pat Garrett before he was a lawman, because bear in mind it wasn't like, hey, go to the University of Alberta and get a 4 years criminal studies degree, then you can come be a lawman, right? No, it was hey, I want to be a lawman. It's like, okay, well, the last one died in like 6 months, bro. So I mean, here's your badge, right?
Pat Garrett actually he was a bison hunter before.
Yeah. Oh wow. Yeah. That's
he was
intense.
one of the guys that exterminated all the bison.
So it's not outside the realm of possibility that before he was a lawman, he did run with Billy at one point or another. And because Billy was a kid, he was because he at his death he was 21. So assuming Pat Garrett knew him 4 years prior, he was 17, 18 years old. He was a kid, so maybe he had empathy for him, and maybe Billy had helped him out at one point. And now, given the opportunity, he lets Billy go, and he lynches some other dude and puts a bullet right in the face, mangles up the face and gives him a red bandana. Oh, it's Billy the Kid, right? Where's my money? You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. Could have happened.
And saves his, but I know we said this in the last episode many times with how incredible some events of history could be, but truth is often stranger than fiction. So, I think that's all I really have to say on Billy the Kid. What about you, Riley?
Yeah, just to touch off, I will say that was speculation, but Billy the Kid's a fun character, man. I had a lot of fun with this episode, honestly. I knew that we were going to get to do a little bit of speculation, tell a lot of cool history about the Midwest, because, yeah, sure, he was famous, but he really is just the embodiment of what the Midwest really was, which was this crazy, and so was the Lincoln County War. This is all a great way to paint the picture of what the Midwest looked like and how tough it was to survive. The characters that it developed, Buckshot Roberts, Billy the Kid. Who was the other one I said earlier? Sombrero Jack. Like all these cool characters, man, surviving out in this area that wasn't America, man. It was owned by natives. It was populated by Hispanics, and then these guys just kind of showed up, and it's a crazy tale, man. And I love talking about it. I had a fun time.
I got to piggyback off what you said there, because 100%. Like the Midwest, the Wild West wasn't like, because of movies in Hollywood, people would think it's like just a bunch of white dudes and then like the one Mexican ranch hand. No, like cowboys originated from Mexico. And it wasn't just white people that were cowboys, or Mexicans or Mexican Americans that were cowboys. There was also some freed African American slaves. There were some Native Americans. There was Mexicans and Mexican Americans, and then there was European settlers, and then there was Americans, right? So there was a lot of people that partook in this culture. And again, like it wasn't America, but through the chaos and the turbulence and the turmoil, you could kind of see that intermingling of cultures and diversities, and like what they did with that, right, and where it led to. That's an entire other podcast in and of itself, though. So we'll.
That's gonna be a standard on this podcast. At least one point, we'll start a train of thought that could lead us down a 2-hour rabbit hole, and then we'll stop ourselves.
100%.
But to touch on what to expect from the podcast, I'm just going to close this out here. Are you okay with that?
100%, brother.
Yeah, man. A couple ways to support the podcast, just to keep this thing going, is patreon.com. Totally up to you guys. We have a Patreon.
We are hungry.
Yeah, we want to eat. No, I'm just kidding. But what we offer on the Patreon is we offer quicker answers. We have a little community going on there. And we also have all the transcripts for the episodes that we write out, which are sometimes this episode was 8 pages. And we offer that all for our Patreon supporters. And it's just a way to keep this podcast ad-free and just allow us to have a little bit more time to research a little bit more and to go into that. more importantly, shoot us emails at humanhistoriespodcast@gmail.com. We would love to get your feedback. If you guys know anything that we missed about Billy the Kid, which we definitely did, shoot us those emails, man. Ask us questions. Follow us on Instagram. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, all at Human Histories Podcast, and just be part of the community. We really want to build a community here, a community of history lovers, armchair historians, and we just kind of want to speculators. We want to build an atmosphere of people that love history, and we want to portray history in a much more approachable way than a history class or some 500-page book. And so we really hope that you enjoyed the podcast. I loved making it. I loved hanging out with you today, Ashton. And we hope to catch you in the next one, man. Follow the podcast. We got some cool stuff coming.
Yeah, thanks for listening, everybody. And we hope to see you in episode number 3, untitled as of now. So have a great night, everyone.
Take it easy.
Or day.
Yeah. Wherever you listen to this, take it easy.